Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's free webinar hosted by the Center for Integrative Sports Nutrition and Functional, I'm getting my words wrong, Functional Sports Nutrition Magazine. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks very much for giving up some of your time to come and listen. We have a really nice range of very much experts in their respective field through this year and every year. And for this particular one, I'm really excited to welcome back Paul Ehren. Paul's one of my closest colleagues within this space. I've known him for several years now. And he basically wears or is capable of wearing many hats. So he's a master's bodybuilding champion, now unfortunately retired. And he's a coach, he's a practitioner, he's a trainer. He works, in his own words, at the coalface, basically working with people in exercise contextual settings, dealing with real life problems. Now, there's a lot of theoretical information out about making weight. You can read many research papers about it, but like in many situations, the theory doesn't quite match up with the practical when you actually get your hands dirty trying to work with somebody who's stripping weight to make a weigh-in or to make a particular perceived correct weight for their sport. So Paul is immensely experienced in this regard in terms of working with people practically. So he's going to give you a run-through presentation. I say run-through because he's lectured a lot more on this topic. There's only so much we can share in sort of 40 minutes, but he'll give you contextual insight to what it takes to help an athlete make weight in their sport. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. And welcome to everyone who's joined us. I'll second Ian's comments about thank you for taking part of your evening out to actually join us. And I hope that you find this of interest. As Ian said, we've got about 40 minutes to actually sprint through this. So all that I can really do in that, I really want to hit as many questions and as many topics as I can. This is not going to be a classic how-to presentation. I just want to make you aware of the entire breadth of what we're talking about here and how sometimes the science doesn't actually tie up, or quite a lot of the time actually, doesn't tie up with the practicalities. And the sheer width of what we're talking about here, and as we'll come on to discuss, making weight actually covers a multitude of sins. Again, as Ian hinted at, Simone and I have actually put together a lecture on this that actually formed part of the exam course a few years ago. And I think Ian is looking to actually make that available as part of CPD requirements or options. So there may well be the full 3-hour lecture, where we do delve into a lot more science on what's going on. A few of my slides have been taken directly from that lecture. But as I say, we're not going to have time to really dig deep into that. So as I say, what I'm really trying to do here is just actually ask some questions and get you thinking laterally. So I certainly don't want to bore you too much with me. Yeah, for 20 years, I was a competitive bodybuilder. All of my stuff was done in the over 40s, over 50s, masters categories. I was fortunate enough to win the British Championship, a heap of regional stuff, and I've competed internationally. And that, as you will see, was done, as we will get on to discuss, was done in quite a different way to what you might actually think. Professionally, I am a master's personal trainer. I've coached for about the same time as I've actually been competing, which really falls into where I gave up a previous career up in the city. So both professionally and sporting wise, I've got some about sort of like 20 years in. So I don't want to bore you anymore with me. So this is really what I want to hit, that making weight is not one-dimensional at all. And this is really what I want you to start thinking about. It's not just about losing weight. I want to make you think. I want to start asking you to start asking questions of both yourself and your clients. And I think that that is the basis of good coaching. So if I can just move on to, I'm sorry if this is going to be a little bit simplistic, but this is the way that I look at quite a lot of coaching. I'm fortunate enough to have use of an apartment down in Carbis Bay in Cornwall, which is a beautiful part of the country. And I use this as a little hideaway from time to time. Now, the Google will tell me that from where I am in Essex, this is 317 miles away, and my journey time will be 5 hours and 29 minutes. So very nice, easy to understand. And if you look at some of the text, that is the way that a lot of people actually sort of look at coaching. But if you actually start looking at the details of the thing, so depending on the time of day that I intend to travel, the day of the week, the volume of the traffic, any possible accidents, roadworks, fuel breaks, meal breaks, road closures, bad weather, getting lost, car problems, there's a huge amount of things that can actually affect that journey time. And this is what I really want to get across, if nothing else, that actually dealing with people, it's not a fact of just 1 + 1 + 1 equals 3. We've got to actually take into account all of these random facts and figures that actually throw at us. And I'll come on to discuss, which a lot of you may have heard me talk about before, my idea of an athlete's ecosystem and how this affects absolutely everything that you're likely to actually deal with. But it very much, you know, Ian is often talking about N = 1, and this is very, very much what we're trying to hit here. So when we start to dig into the detail a little bit more, then if we are making weight in its broadest possible terms, what are we actually looking to do? And I think this is quite a nice slide because this shows the 3 most important. So we've got the obvious, achieving a weight category, we've got performance, and we've got aesthetics. And we've got, which is probably more important, we've got the way that these things interact as well, which is vitally important. And to a lesser or greater extent, all of these athletes and the ones that we will come on to talk about, they've all got to take one or more of these into some sort of context. So if we just start to sort of like move on 3, this is my definition of what making weight actually involves. So it can be weight gain as well as weight loss. We'll look at some athletes where it's completely different. So this is my definition of what making weight is all about. Manipulation of ideal body composition and or weight dependent upon the athlete's environment. And environment to me is everything that surrounds that athlete. Obviously their sport, but everything else that actually goes along with it as well. So taking that context, let's just look here at two of my clients. Guy called Mason Jones on the left-hand side, UFC fighter, mixed martial artist. Right-hand side, guy called Danny Williams, who's a judo player, and he's an Olympian. So we've most definitely actually got the making weight, because both of these guys, funnily enough, they both fight at a similar weight of ish 75 kg, there or thereabouts. So if these guys don't make weight, then they don't compete. So it is vitally important for them to actually make that weight, but the whole performance avenue comes into it. Now, if Danny's not performing correctly, then this slide that we've got up here is going to be reversed pretty quickly. Danny's going to find himself flat on his back with the referee shouting Ippon over the top of him pretty quickly. Mason on the left-hand side potentially can get seriously hurt in his sport if he's not actually performing to his best. So with these two guys, we've got A, to actually hit the weight, but B, we've got to make absolutely certain that they're also performing at the highest possible level as well. And that mix is not the easiest thing in the world to do. Now, I was pretty fortunate when I was competing. Here's yours truly with someone, it's me on the right-hand side, and a good friend of mine, Andy Lawley, on the left-hand side, who I had a lot of battles with. This was during the course of one of the British finals that I competed at. Now, as a bodybuilder, all that we had to do on stage was do these funny poses and pull these even funnier faces while we were actually going through. Actual performance of an athletic feat didn't come into it. And even though our body fat levels are down to pretty decent levels here, you do hear bodybuilders talking about 4 or 5% body fat, which I've never believed for a second, to be quite honest. If you take visceral fat in, 4% body fat is next to dead. But we were at a very decent body fat level. But with likes of me and Andy, we could go to extremes if it actually needed to, and we could do crazy things like 0 carbs for sort of days on end. If we go back to the previous slide, then 0 carb in the likes of Mason and Danny would not be the best idea, because believe you and me, when we're standing on stage on this, then we're probably feeling at our absolute worst. So the cheesy grins that we've both got really portray an awful lot of other things that are actually going on there. We're certainly not feeling like that. And even though I don't want to get involved in it in this particular lecture, for bodybuilders in particular, there were a lot of actual sort of like dark arts actually going on. The only thing that I would say, if any of you do deal with physique athletes in any type, I would shy away from actually testing body fat with them, because you'll probably mess with their heads, because it will probably come out higher than what they think it's going to be. And it's a visual sport. So we never, ever tested body fat levels. It was purely the way that you looked. Okay, moving on. Now, these two examples, very much two sides of the power to weight ratio performance type coin. We've got a group of guys here that Ehren a few years ago may well have been quite closely associated with back in South Africa. We've got the Springbok front row. So we've got a bunch of guys here, probably somewhere in the region of about 1.82 meters tall, and possibly somewhere in the region of 110, 130 kg per man. So size as well as strength. And, you know, you can tell, even with the shirts on, you can tell that these guys are not ripped, to use a phrase, but you know, they're exactly what they need to be for the sport that they're actually performing. Then on the other side of the coin, we've got Mr. Andrinov, who was one of the most decorated Soviet gymnasts of all time. And, you know, same as all gymnasts, he looks a unit. You see him in isolation and he looks a very muscular man. But I think that his stats were something the reason, I think he was about 5'5" tall and somewhere in the region of about 60 kg. For fairly obvious reasons, you're not actually going to get a 16-stone man performing moves like that on the rings, the crucifix on the rings, because you'll completely destroy the power to weight ratio. So different, this is two extremes of the same continuum, that it very much depends on the nature of the sport that you're dealing with, on how you're going to approach this making weight. With the guys, the Springbok guys, it may well be that you've got to put 5 kilos on them rather than take 5 kilos off. Now, incidentally, I don't want to get too far into the weeds actually on this, but Andronov is quite an interesting case, because I've spoken about before, and it's been the subject of some debate on the forum about longevity in athletes and how training regimes can actually affect an athlete's longevity. Andronov actually died in his 50s of a degenerative neurological disorder, something called multiple system atrophy. And towards the end of his life, he couldn't move his arms and his legs, and he couldn't talk. And it makes me wonder whether the well-documented brutal regimes that he was actually going through actually sort of like contributed to that. It's a side point, but I do find that quite interesting. So then we start to move on and looking at, so we've got track and field here, and we've got cyclists, but we could be picking a number of other disciplines as well. And for these guys, we've now got to look, not as I did, at individual events or a maximum of maybe 2 or 3 events, but we've got to look at very much different approaches to different stages of someone's season. So with the cyclists, with the athlete, fundamentally, we'd be looking at an off-season block, a competition block, and then a major championship block. And the training and the diet would have to fit in, the protocols that we'd have to come up with would have to fit in with peaking these guys at the correct time, which then we're starting to get involved as well with interrelationships with other coaches. And this is where a lot of difficulties can actually crop up as well, because people can become very, very protective of their own fields in all of this. So you would need to discuss with the athlete, you would need to discuss with the other coaches exactly what is expected of you, as looking at it from a purely nutrition point of view, and how they want to approach the season, where they want the athlete to peak, what's feasible and what isn't feasible. And then moving on from there, I've realized that this is very much an American slide, so apologies for that, but we've got to take into account team sports. So obviously we've got a number of things actually here. So American football, ice hockey, soccer, basketball, baseball, you know, cricket will come into it, netball would come into it. So the requirements of those individual sports would also be entirely different. And not only that, positions within the sports would be entirely different. So you've got to, again, look at your athlete, the situation that actually surrounds that athlete, and make the plans accordingly. So hopefully you're seeing that this is becoming much, much wider than just controlling sort of someone's weight and then the level that these guys are at. Now, fortunately, we've got both men and women shown in this slide, which is obviously another huge factor. The whole question of gender differences, we can't just treat women as smaller versions of men. I know that we've had a lot of interaction through the various groups about female training, but it is something that we've most definitely got to take into account. And then when we are dealing with team sports, it's my experience that it is the interaction with other coaches that becomes much more prevalent when we are looking at other sports as well, team sports as well, because again, people start to become very, very protective. The strength and conditioning coach will be looking after his part and be protecting his part. The skilled coach will actually be doing theirs. The therapists will actually be looking after their side and be very protective of that. So we've got to fit into that context, and then the level of sport that we've actually got to deal with as well. When we start looking at sort of like ecosystems, this is going to be very different. If we've got elite sports, if we just look at football for a moment, if we're looking at Premier League footballers who are earning £100,000 a week plus, then these guys are going to be pretty dedicated on what they actually do. If we're looking at something like, I see that Adam Lloyd is with us, who looks after a football academy, and I don't think too many of Adam's people, in all fairness, are earning £100,000 a week. So there's going to be different motivations with those guys. So again, so many different things to actually start taking into account. Now, I think this is absolutely paramount to a lot of the things that we do. And the protocols and habits that you've established with your client, with an athlete out of season, will be absolutely magnified tenfold post-competition. Now, this is where obviously the stresses start to become more, whether it's an individual sport, whether it's a team sport. As soon as you start looking towards competition, as soon as you start looking towards competition for places, then the stress of everything becomes much more finely tuned. Now, I personally think that one of the most difficult situations that you can be put in as a coach is to be introduced to an athlete, whether that's an individual athlete, whether it's a team member, and being told that this guy has got a competition in X number of weeks' time. Get him in shape. Get him in a position that he can actually compete for his place. This person is unknown to you. You've got absolutely no idea what they're about. And it becomes so difficult to actually learn this person and everything that surrounds that person quickly, with the added stresses being added on to sort of like everything. Ideally, I will be working with a person well into their off season, and I can learn much more about them. People's relationship with food. Now, their diet may be absolutely spot on. They may have a Krispy Kreme habit like you wouldn't believe. Funnily enough, I had an email just the other day from a client who told me that his diet was pretty good and he just needs things actually tidied up. When he sent me the details, his weekly diet, his Monday to Friday diet, was pretty good. But he freely admitted that he relaxed, to use his phrase, at the weekends and just really hit the Mackie D's and the takeaways and everything. And I had to point out to him that taking those 2 days out of his week was practically 30% of his week. You cannot possibly be seriously preparing for anything with 30% of your diet being not only suboptimum, but absolutely rank poor. So it's strange on people's perception of these things. So if at all possible, I know that we can't pick and choose our clients, but if at all possible, don't be put in a situation where you've got a client that you've really got to work with on the nitty-gritty as a starting point. If you can possibly work with that person, learn that person as a human being as well as an athlete, then I know we're not always in that perfect situation, but that is the way that I would always recommend it being done. Now, this is a slide taken from the previous lecture that Simone and I actually did, and this is a pretty straightforward, this is almost calories in, calories out type equation, and all the sort of stuff that you will recognize, nothing particularly sort of like complicated here. So we've got the energy intake, energy output, thermic effect on food, and the macro makeup of what we're doing. So all pretty straightforward. The effect of high intensity exercise, if you've worked with athletes at all, then you'll have a pretty good idea of all of this. This is pretty much nutrition 101. But of course, things don't actually work like this. And the big thing that will come into everything is exactly this. Individual nuances, n equals 1. And again, it's only when you start working with an athlete that you'll actually start to find out exactly why this particular protocol is not working with them, why it's working tremendously. And it's as important to find out why something is working as to why it's not working. And then you can try and actually sort of like replicate it. Again, this is a slide from our previous lecture. And these are all of the things that can maybe not actually have an effect on your athletes. We talk about set point with an athlete, which to me, there's a number of different definitions, but set point to me with an individual is where their weight will naturally drift to. Some people will find that they'll naturally put body fat on. They may naturally put muscle on, but they may naturally put body fat on. Others may struggle to put any sort of weight on, whether it's good functional weight or any form. It's a little bit of an outmoded concept, but that will work. I've adjusted my, and I've just been, if you look at, again, outmoded concepts, but the old mesomorph, ectomorph, etc. I've been just about every one of those throughout my career. And at one point, to break through a barrier, because naturally I'm not a big man, to break through a barrier, I got myself up to 20 stone, just over 20 stone. It was not pleasant. It was probably one of the most uncomfortable things that I've ever done, but it was done for purpose. But I do agree, this settling point, which is more a factor of everything that we're talking about here, and it's movable. But once again, the big question mark is probably the most important thing. And this is exactly where I would be coming from. So little success in defining a body weight set point. Rather, it's more likely the body weight is determined by a settling point, being the result of many different contributing factors. And with those factors being of different strength and nature. And once again, likely to differ for each individual. I can't stress this enough. Successful body weight strategies will depend on identifying the main contributors and examining to what extent they are important for body weight maintenance for a certain individual. What works for one won't work for another. And I've seen myself through my career, 1 year can be different from another as well. What you did last year might not work for this year's protocol. So even with the same individual, things may actually change as you start to run through. Again, a slide from the previous lecture, and this is where we're really starting to dig into the science. Now, I haven't got time with this chat to actually go through all of this, but I do find it very interesting to actually work through these. And whether you're working with athletes or whether you're working with other individuals, and a lot of you have probably studied this before, but obviously maintaining body weight, increasing body weight, losing body weight, you have got the psychological, you've got the physiological, you've got the neuro aspect of it all. So starting from the bottom, you've got the preprandial, you know, the thought of food, the smell of food, the thought of, you know, the whole thing will stimulate appetite. You can then eat before you absorb, after you absorb. All of these things are going to have an effect hormonally with neurotransmitters. Everything is going to have an effect. But personally, we can look at each of these. We can look at the effect of leptin and ghrelin. We can look at GLP. We can study all of these individual factors, and I find it very interesting to do so. We can look at the effect of glucose and free fatty acids and amino acids and how they're likely to actually affect things with individuals, and we can really start to tie this down. And I would encourage you to do so, but I would also encourage you to then take that and park it. So you've got that information there, but from a personal point of view, I think this is more important. Now, this is the ecosystem that we were actually talking about. And to me, this has got an overwhelming greater effect on an athlete than all of the other things that we've actually spoken about. So again, Adam, forgive me for going back to your football team, but within Adam's academy, we've got a lot of young adults, a lot of children actually involved. So let's pick one of those, peer pressure. Peer pressure with young adults is going to be huge. And if we work slightly more elite on that, team culture is going to be huge. And if you've got the pressure of other individuals, it could be within the team, it could be outside the team. But if all of your peer group, if all of your friends are running down to KFCs to stack up on fried chicken, and you're trying to tell them that you've got to stay behind and eat boiled turkey, broccoli and sweet potato, you've got to be quite a strong personality to do that. And within the elite setting, the team culture, you're always going to have people rise to the top. You're going to have the alpha male, the alpha female. What is their attitude? It's going to be difficult. Social demographic, again, is huge. It's going to be far easier preaching to someone with a reasonable amount of money to spend, whose mum and dad know how to cook, the benefits of home-cooked food, of organic food, trying to speak to a city kid whose mum and dad have never cooked in their lives and they've lived off takeaways. You can have your work cut out to actually work with that. And all of these things that I've actually got in here are going to have a major, major effect on your individual. And that's why I was saying before, it's so difficult to take an athlete out of the blue and be given, right, this guy's got a fight, he's got a race meet, he's got this, he's got that, in 20 weeks time, get him in shape. You know nothing about them. And it's this learning process that you've really got to go through in actually, in my way of actually bringing these people around. Now, again, this is going slightly off-piste, but it is something that I want you to consider as well. The fighting sports, as well as bodybuilding, are somewhat notorious, I'm afraid to say, for the dark arts of cutting weight. And these are just some of the headlines which have actually come up, and it's a fairly regular thing. Unfortunately, people will go to extremes to actually lose weight, because if they are that driven to actually perform, they will do crazy things. Now, I'll be the first one to admit that as a bodybuilder, there was quite a lot of pharmaceuticals actually involved to achieve the leanness that we did. Don't think for a second that slightly further down the food chain, people are not using these things. The fighting sports again, now I've seen this time after time, that particularly the old school coaches, they're still going to have guys in July training in gyms with the radiators full on, with tracksuits and bin liners on, to actually lose weight. The educational process that you've got to go through with these is going to be gradual, but you have got a big responsibility, particularly with fighters. Now, I'm not saying that everyone out there is going to start working with boxers or MMA fighters. This is just an extreme example. But when we sort of like come down to it, you are putting your athletes in a position where they're probably at their most unhealthiest. That, you know, we've spoken about it so many times within the concept of FSN and CISN, of, you know, the overreaching, how dangerous it is to push too far. But all athletes will. I know myself, I'm just coming off the back of 5 weeks of shingles, which has been extremely unpleasant. And I'm convinced that it's me overreaching. It's me pushing myself. I'm the greatest one in the world for giving advice, but not taking my own advice. So be aware, but there's always a but. Again, my client, Danny, you will find that a lot of sportsmen, particularly fighters, when they're focusing in, they don't consider themselves actually getting ready for a fight unless they are doing certain things. And with Danny, it was sweating off that last little bit of weight. That was his thing. He just sitting in a sauna with a tracksuit on, that just made him, that was his way of mentally getting ready for a fight. But as you can see, what I've actually got down here, no more than a couple of kilograms, with an absolute top end of 5% of his competitive weight, which was 73 kilos. So 3.5 kilograms. Now, Danny knew through experience, and I knew through experience, he could deal with that. But again, it's a learning process. But just be aware that sometimes you've got to bend with the wind slightly on what puts your particular athlete in the best place. Now, I find this quite interesting. Quite a recent research paper, September last year. And this was more a sort of meta-analysis. They were taking a lot of facts and figures from a good number of different papers, and they were coming up with a sort of how-to list. They were coming up with their recommendations. And some of their recommendations were protein levels of between 2.2 and 3 grams per kilogram of body weight a day, carbohydrate intake between 2.5 and 5 kilograms, so kilograms body weight a day, obviously dependent upon activity. Fats, 0.5 gram to 1 gram, again, kilogram body weight per day. If you find the paper, it's free view on PubMed. So take a look through, it will go into all of the details. They were talking about 3 to 6 meals a day, 1 protein meal intake 2 to 3 hours before training, 1 protein intake 2 to 3 hours sort of post-training, inclusion of a complete variety of fruit and veg. They were talking about the inclusion of creatine between 3 and 5 grams, up to 5 to 10 grams a day in larger athletes. They were talking about caffeine intake of 1 to 3 milligrams kilogram of body weight to reduce tiredness, between 3 and 6 milligrams kilogram body weight, 30 to 60 minutes prior to training to improve performance. I would consider that very formulaic. And at the complete other end of that, these are quotes from my old coach who I worked with throughout my career. I don't think an athlete can coach themselves properly. I think they need another set of, we always said, someone needs another set of eyes, particularly for a physique athlete where it is very much visual. But I think an athlete finds it very difficult to coach themselves. You need that objective look of eyes. Now, when me and Dean were working together, we never counted calories once. We never counted grams of protein, carbohydrates, or fats once. Everything was visual. We knew how much we were taking in, so we knew that we were eating 8 ounces of chicken, 5 ounces of potato, whatever it may be, and we adjusted it through that. The only time that I've ever actually put macronutrients to any of this is when I had to do articles or lectures, and people seem to like these things. So this is exactly what I was saying. We've yet to count calories or grams of protein, and as I say, Dean, not only a hugely successful bodybuilder in his own right, but also one of the best coaches with one of the best eyes that I've ever seen in physique sports at all. So there you've got the two polar extremes. You've got the complete scientific method on one hand, and you've got Dean's approach on the other. My own view is that there's a meeting of minds in this, and this is the perfect synergy of science and art. With me, I would take an athlete. Now, hopefully I've known this athlete for some time, and we would look at the date of whatever competition it is. We would look at the condition of the athlete at the time. We would look at the experience of the athlete. It's his first time of doing whatever he's actually doing? What is his current nutritional status? We would then set a time scale. Now, with bodybuilding and fighters, tended to be similar, maybe 12, 14, 16 weeks. We'd set a time scale. We'd give ourselves some time for things possibly going wrong in there, illness, any little setback. And then during that, we'd monitor every aspect of what is actually going on, not just whether they're performing, whether they're starting to look the way that they should do, but everything actually involved. So I would be monitoring mood, I would be monitoring digestion, I would be monitoring sleep, obviously performance, their strength and their stamina, how they were feeling. At some point with particularly physique athletes, particularly in the last week, it was really a matter, Paul, I'm feeling like shit. Well, I'm sorry, you just got to suck it up, buttercup, and get on with it. But obviously there's limits. So and there's going to be huge difference in the modalities. You wouldn't treat a bodybuilder in the same way as you would a fighter. You wouldn't treat a fighter the same way as you would a track and field athlete. So as I say, it's the blending, the way that I see it, it's the blending of the art that I've come up with for 20 years with the science that comes from all of this great research, which is also out there as well. If you can marry those two together, then you've just about got the thing right. And the one thing that I haven't mentioned, this is the last slide. And again, everyone tends to concentrate on macros, but think food quality. A very good friend of mine is a performance chef who actually looks after a lot of Premier League footballers. Now, his starting entry-level price to work with him is £600 a week. But the quality of the ingredients that he uses are phenomenal. And when you see what he does, now again, looking at someone's ecosystems, their economic status, etc., it might not be possible. But again, this is a whole different argument that the quality of the food that that person takes in is going to be huge. That is all of my slides. That is really the end of the lecture. I apologise for anyone who was looking for the real detail of all of this, but as I say, in 40 minutes, I could literally have gone on for another 3 hours here and spoken about every single one of those little areas that I've spoken about. But I just hope that that's opened up a few people's minds, got you thinking about a few questions on how you're likely to actually interact with your clients. I thank you very much for your time. I hope that you found this interesting to some point. And yeah, I thank you all very much for listening. Ian, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Paul. And as Paul said there, he can't cover the huge detail in this time, but I think what he's done very nicely is built the context, and that needs to always come first, not the detail, not the numbers. The numbers should be the last thing if you indeed are going to look at numbers. So we're going to move on in a sec to a Q&A. So please, Paul will have stimulated a few thoughts in your mind. There might be some specifics that you would like him to go in deeper on. So please start throwing through questions on the chat box. I would like to just mention to everyone that in a month's time, on the 10th of June, we're starting our next CISN, or Certificate of Integrative Sports Nutrition course. So if you're interested, if you've been thinking about it, we're going to surge ahead with that. Just go onto our webpage and have a look at details, and you can fire us an email. We're going to announce a competition tomorrow. I was hoping we'd have it ready for tonight, but alas, we don't have the fine details quite yet. So we're going to announce a competition for a sponsored place on that course. So some of you might be quite keen on getting into that competition. We'll send through details on email tomorrow. So through Zoom, we have all your emails. So we'll send you that along with slides and the recording link. And we'll also be putting it up on social media. So let's get over to the Q&A. Let me see. Right. I'm going to start with Scott. He's got a question. He's interested in Paul's practical experience in under 18 athletes and making weight in bodybuilding. So I don't know if that's two different questions or a blended question.
Well, I can certainly, young athletes and bodybuilders always makes me a little bit twitchy, to be quite honest, Scott, simply because they're so impressionable and they will listen to absolutely anyone. And what tends to happen, again, there's a culture in the physique world, probably in other athletic disciplines as well, that they'll ask the biggest guy in the gym, what's the best way to put weight on? They'll ask the guy with the biggest biceps, what's the best way to build biceps? They'll ask the guy who gets absolutely shredded, what's the best way to lose weight? And that can start to lead them down some quite tricky and potentially dangerous paths. As I say, there is a huge culture in bodybuilding of pharmaceutical use. And don't think for a second that is just at the elite level. I'm always constantly shocked at the questions that I get asked from people just, you would never think of it. People are just training normal commercial gyms who are taking this, that, and the other. It's quite scary. So what my experience would tend me to how I would answer this question, Scott, is make sure that that athlete is listening to you and you alone. Try and really get that guy's trust. Now, it will help if you've been there and done it and you're something of a face in that particular sport yourself. Now, I know that that doesn't amount for anything. Not every great athlete is a great coach by any stretch of the imagination at all, but people will connect the two. But you've got to try and get that athlete's trust, because believe you and me, they will shop for answers and they will come up with about 10 different answers and pick the one that they like the most. And you can very quickly get someone going round and round in ever decreasing circles and disappearing up their own whatnot. If you don't get them its trust in their coach. That goes for all athletes, but I think in particular, young athletes. Now, that position of trust between coach and athlete, again, it's something I've lectured on before, that can be really abused. And we've all seen cases where not only to the detriment of an athlete's health, but also we've seen where physical sexual abuse has actually come about. So that can really be overplayed. But you've got to come down to that position of trust. So my overriding situation of that, dealing with young guys, particularly where their bodies are just developing. At the age of 18, someone's body hasn't developed. That is going to be changing dramatically. So you've got someone there who could be competing for the next 10 years, or you could put them off for life with whatever you actually put them through. So what I would say to you is that I would first of all get that athlete's trust. And then secondly, very importantly, and this goes for all modalities, but particularly physique, you've got to be honest with the athlete. If you're not honest, if you're leading that athlete along, yeah, I think you're going to be fine. My fee is this, just keep paying me this and everything will be fine on the day. You've got to be honest with your athlete. If you honestly think that that guy's not going to be ready for a competition in 6 months' time, I've lost count of the number of times where I've sat down with someone and I've said to them, we're looking at a 5-year plan. I'm sorry, we're not looking at competition next year. Now, this may well cross over to track and field on other disciplines, but particularly physique. So I know it's a long way. I'm sorry, Scott. I've got a habit of doing this. It's a very long way of answering your question. But the two things: get the athlete's trust and be honest with them. Those are the two things that I would highlight first of all. Sorry, Ian, I do tend to drag on.
Yeah, I'll just come on and tell you you're waffling next time. All right. Okay, right. We've got a question from, sorry, I had it a sec ago. I've just had one more that's displaced it. Okay, what is the most common misconception you come across from athletes and coaches regarding losing body fat? And that's from Paul.
Again, I think a lot of it really depends on what you're calling an athlete and how they've actually been sort of like brought up. Because again, looking at a physique athlete, it's not just losing weight, but it's maintaining muscle size as well as losing weight. And I think that probably, again, looking at looking at track and field, probably not as much. But I think the biggest misconception that I've come across generally is the existence of the magic pill or the silver bullet. Oh, if only I do this, then I will lose weight. I will get into shape. I will be able to perform at this, that, and the other. Whereas in actual fact, there is absolutely no such thing. It's 24-hour dedication and just keep on doing what you're doing. So I think people come into these things very starry-eyed, and they see people actually cutting weight and making it look relatively easy, maybe, and they think the whole process is easy. So I think in a nutshell, it's that search for the magic bullet, or just this thing that will make everything easier. Whereas, as I say, we've got to take into account, we haven't got to put all of this onto our athlete, but we as coaches have got to take all of the minutiae in and just get them away from the concept. If only you do this, or if only you do that, and forget about reading this magazine or that magazine. Trust the process. I think that's, as I say, in summary, that's what I'd come up with in.
Cool. Right, Adam has a question. You talked about individuality. Have you seen people respond to different ways of eating that you thought wouldn't work, but did? That's
100%.
a nice question.
Very, very much so. I'll give you, and this is where we're actually very much on a sort of like a learning process. I'll give you an extreme example about myself. You can get to the point when you're actually losing weight, again, particularly in physique, where we are going to extremes, where your metabolism just takes on its own beast, and everything's going into overdrive. And no matter what you do, you're losing weight. And I've literally had to go down to Tesco's, buy myself a family ready-made lasagna, a tub of Ben & Jerry's, and eat that every night. So God knows how many calories was actually involved in it. I'm getting something like 10,000 calories just to stop me actually losing weight. Now that is just so counterintuitive, but I simply could not get enough good food. That would be a huge amount of brown rice or sweet potato to actually get in to get my metabolism back to where it was. And yeah, everyone will respond differently. Some people, again, to take a fairly obvious, some people will metabolize carbs in a totally different way, particularly males, females. You may see a huge difference between metabolism of carbs between a man and a woman, and even between two guys. They may thrive on fats. They may thrive on carbohydrate. And this is where I'm saying that you've got to try these things out. And with yourself, Adam, you can't actually come up with a group think situation where the nutritional protocol for the entire team is going to be this, because some people it work really well, but you're always going to get those outliers. I think one of the first slides that I ever remember Ian drawing up when I was taking the exam was carb loading and fat loading, and with cyclists, and you had outliers with people who did really well on things that should never have worked with the majority of people. So it's only when you start working with someone, yeah, the majority of people, maybe 7 out of 10, you can come up with a rough idea and it will work. But you're going to get those outliers that are always going to be exactly that, outliers. And they're simply not going to react in the way that you think they're going to react. So yeah, very much so. I would be interested, Adam, just to sort of throw it back at you really. I would be interested to hear, whether it's now or another time, what's the biggest problem that you've actually come across with getting nutrition across to your guys? You know, because you've got a hugely disparate group there, different backgrounds, different ethnic makeups, different ages. There must be a huge melting pot of stuff that actually comes in there. I'm working with a team. I say at some point I'll be very interested to see whether there's one thing that keeps cropping up that's your real bugbear. But I say not necessarily now, but I'd love to hear a bit of feedback. But thanks very much for the compliments. I'm pleased you enjoyed it. Okay, thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just invite any last questions or discussion points or things you'd just like to kind of highlight that you thought was really good that came out of the presentation. That's always helpful for other people as well. I'll just sort of back up what Paul's saying about that individuality. You just sometimes you get into your own comfort zone as a practitioner, but then somebody will come in and it just, what you're doing just doesn't work and you have to shift it a lot. And sometimes it can sound a bit polarized, like, you know, high carb, high fat. And unfortunately, sports nutrition is very shrouded in a cloud of macros. And it has been for half a century now. We're now 50 years into the carb is king thing. That's been challenged a bit, but we need to go much more diverse in our thinking. And one thing I would say is, if you listen to Paul and say, well, there's so much individuality, where do I start? The start is a word that's on that slide right there in front of you, and that's quality. And even if you can't afford to shop at Whole Foods, which is seriously expensive, how about tapping into your local fruit and veg shops and organic box schemes, get to know farmers? You know, there's various ways of building that quality that doesn't cost the earth. And that's the basis that everyone needs. And then you can build in that individuality. That's a really good question I was once asked in a talk. It's like, okay, yeah, I'm a bit confused now because you're going on about individuality. Name a few things that everyone can do that will improve health. Okay, Adam's saying, definitely love to chat to you about that, Paul. The tradition of McDonald's after away games for my younger ones always causes me to think. If anyone wants to hear Adam in action, we have his webinar from last year, 2021, on our webinar page. You just need to scroll down and you see recordings of old ones. Okay, so I think that's it for questions. Paul, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Ed.
That was great, a great perspective builder. So yeah, thank you. Next month, please come back. We have Karen Harrison. She's going to be talking about bone health from genetic perspectives, and obviously, like everything we do in a sporting context. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Have a good month, and we'll see you in June.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thanks, Paul.